Greetings, Gilliam the Rogue here, once again with an Elder Scrolls Online Let's Talk segment. Today we will be discussing the Restoration Staff and all of its abilities to perform in the meta for PvE and PvP alike. We will kick things right off with our active abilities, the first being the main spammable of the skill line, called Force Shock. Force Shock can be casted from a 28 meters range, scales off of max Magicka, spell damage, spell critical, and spell penetration, and will deal all elemental types, including flame, frost, and shock damage per cast. This means it has a 3-part component every time it hits. Since they will be broken into 3 parts, that means that add-ons such as Foundry Tactical Combat or Combat Metrics will display them as damage types. So if we open FTC, we notice that Force Shock is recorded as a single entity. We see 3 hits from a single cast. Meanwhile, add-ons such as Combat Metrics will break them into 3. The orange being fire, yellow being lightning, and the whitish blue being shock. So this is very helpful in terms of theory crafting. It allows you to see what is your maximum damage. It also shows damage discrepancies based on passives and whatnot. So keep that in mind, that it will be doing 3 different damage types, meaning it will be checking 3 unique resistances: the enemy's frost resistance, shock resistance, and lightning resistance, as PvE mobs have separate resistances based on what type of mob they are, such as humanoid, Daedra, etc., and will be susceptible to some elements while resistant to others. Force Shock is a very easy skill to weave, as we see here. It operates extremely fluidly, and it is an instant cast, meaning we can cast it once per second thanks to global cooldowns. Very, very strong in that regard, and since it has 3 damage components, it will also make proc sets based off of damage 3 times more potent. If we use sets like Grothar, which is 10% chance when dealing damage, every time we use Force Pulse, it will be a 30% chance every cast, allowing it to be much more efficient in terms of proccing item sets, allowing Force Shock to be a very strong spammable. While its damage might not be competitive with other skills like biting jabs and whatnot, it also has advantages that other skills might not, allowing it to be very, very strong for both the Sorcerer and Nightblade class, as their main spammables are quite weak. Now we will begin looking at our morphs, and our first morph is called Crushing Shock. And Crushing Shock adds an interrupt, where wherever you hit a target casting an ability, you will interrupt them, set them off balance, and stun them for 3 seconds. So the nice thing about this is, if we remember our champion point system, the ritual tree, there is a passive called Exploiter, meaning anytime we set an enemy off balance or stun them, we will be proccing Exploiter for ourselves if we have it, or if our allies have this. So very, very strong in that regard. However, in PvE, not many mobs will be casting, and those who do can be simply bashed, as they will be close in range. However, it is nice for a few niche applications where mobs will be far away. However, if your tanks are doing their job, or other people, such as Dragon Knights using chains, can pull them in, allowing you to not have to run this. However, in PvP, things change up. Many times there will be casters such as Templars spamming Beam or Dark Flare, Sorks hard casting frags, although hopefully they're not, as well as other cast times, which Crushing Shock will really help alleviate a lot of damage, setting enemies off balance each and every time they cast. It should be noted that you can be interrupted even if you are CC immune, meaning that Crushing Shock and other interrupts are going to be very vital, especially in Cyrodiil against Sorcerers, and that is because Dark Deal in its current state is extremely strong at the moment, so Crushing Shock and other interrupts are really going to help deal with a lot of countering of classes, because almost every class that's performing at a very high meta, Templars and Sorks, are doing extremely well thanks to cast times. So very, very useful tool in Cyrodiil, but in PvE, not so much. Our other morph is called Force Pulse, and this is the go-to PvE morph. What Force Pulse does is it increases the base damage it deals by about 100, as well as adding additional mechanic where anytime a target nearby, up to 2, will take cleave damage if that enemy is afflicted with burning, chilled, or concussed. And these are status effects. So what are these? Burning, Chilled, and Concussed are status effects, meaning that they are procced via damage elements. So Burning will have a small chance to proc off of fire damage, Chilled will proc off of ice damage, and Concussed will proc off of lightning damage. Now, what do each of these do? Burning applies a damage over time component that deals fire damage, it lasts 6 seconds, and it does quite high damage, the strongest DPS status effect in the game. The next is Chilled, and in its current state, all Chilled does is it snares. Since this is the PTS, Chilled has been reworked from snaring enemies to now applying minor maim. This means they will deal 15% less damage for the duration. And then Concussed, since this is PTS, has also been reworked from applying minor maim to applying minor vulnerability, meaning they will take 8% more damage from all sources. So anytime an enemy is afflicted with Burning, Chilled, or Concussed, if that target is within 5 meters of the initial target you have casted this on, they will take splash damage, meaning it is very, very strong in that regard. However, this isn't why we take the morph for PvE. The main reason we take it is simply because it does more damage than Crushing Shock. So very straightforward, easy to use, very strong at proccing item sets like Grothdar or Narayaneth, as well as Burning Spellweave, since we will have flame damage, and then it also increases our chance to apply status effects, as even if we are using a fire staff, we will still be doing all 3 elements, meaning we'll be able to proc all 3 status effects, really increasing our utility and DPS. So Force Pulse is a very, very strong ability, and it's why it has stuck in the meta for so long. It should also be noticed that Force Shock next patch will not be able to be reflected as well, so this is a very nice boon for PvP players who are forced into running this ability, mainly sorcerers, as Force Shock was able to be reflected, and that will no longer be the case. Our next ability is the AoE damage over time ground effect skill of the Destruction Staff skill line called Wall of Elements. And if we look here, it scales off of max Magicka, spell damage, spell critical, as well as spell penetration. Very strong skill, costs more Magicka than our spammable, but that's because the duration is a dot, so it lasts 6 seconds, meaning it will also scale with Elemental Expert and Thaumaturge in the champion point system. It's a very simple ability. It deals magic. It says it deals magic damage. However, this changes based on what type of staff you're using. So if you cast it on a fire staff, it will do flame, lightning if you use a lightning staff, and frost if you use a frost staff. So if we look here, it says magic damage, but when it's actively on my bar, since I'm using a flame staff, it will be converted to Wall of Fire. Very straightforward. All it does is it says it gains a new type depending on your staff. I have just explained that. Wall of Fire deals extra damage to burning enemies. So what that means is you deal 20% additional damage to burning enemies, meaning Wall of Fire has the highest DPS potential out of all of the elemental types. So if you are a DPS, you will take Wall of Fire, as it is the most optimal. The next is Wall of Frost, which will reduce enemy movement speed and immobilize chilled enemies, meaning if they are chilled already, they will be rooted. The lightning version, called Wall of Storm, sets concussed enemies off balance, meaning if they are afflicted with concussed or minor vulnerability, they will be set off balance, enabling for the exploiter passive to be procced. So for DPS, you're either going to be using Wall of Fire or Wall of Elements, as Wall of Frost currently is being reworked, or as Frost Staves are currently being reworked into tanking. You won't really want to be using them as a damage source. However, in PvP, you might use them if your build is catered to such. Wall of Fire is one of the strongest AoE dots in the game, pulling about 20% of overall damage on cleave fights, such as hard mode Rakat. This is an extremely strong tool in and of itself, and its morphs make it even stronger. Now we'll begin looking at them. Our first is called Unstable Wall of Elements. How this skill works is instead of coating an area in front of you, it places 3 nodes that also cover an area in front of you, that after the initial 6-second duration, each node will explode, dealing magic damage or whatever damage your staff is using. So again, if you're using a flame staff, the bombs will explode for fire damage, etc. It will retain its secondary effects, so Wall of Fire will still do 20% more, Wall of Frost will still immobilize chilled enemies, and Wall of Storms will set enemies off balance that are concussed. So the really deceptive thing about Unstable Wall is that its explosion hits 3 times. I will demonstrate after I explain the second morph, but just looking at the tooltip, it seems like, oh, hey, it's not that good. It only does about 1.4 or 140% additional damage of 1 tick, so it's not that good. But in reality, those nodes can hit multiple times. So if an enemy is large enough, they can be hit by all 3, allowing for some extreme DPS and burst damage. Meaning in PvP, while Wall of Elements may be walked out of, you can explode it, allowing for additional damage, or place it in an area that an enemy has to walk through, such as choke points and towers, allowing for some great burst damage. In PvE, it can be said as well. The 6-second duration is harder to manage than its other morph, but if able to be utilized by a player fast enough and skilled enough to incorporate it in their rotation, Unstable Wall will deal more damage than our other morph. And now we will look at our other morph, Elemental Blockade. It will do the same thing with all of its secondary effects, meaning burning enemies take 20% more, and so on. All this morph does is adds 2 seconds onto the duration. So instead of lasting 6, it will last 8, meaning we get 2 more damage sources. This is usually the morph to go for PvE for most players because 8 seconds of a dot is quite easy to maintain. It's not too hard and it's not too easy. 8 seconds is going to be shorter than some of our other ones in our class skills. Like usually class dots will last 10 to 15 seconds. Elemental is going to be 8, but it's going to be very, very strong, meaning we're always going to want to keep it up. But in terms of holistic DPS, if you are a skilled player or if your rotation has long dots and you have room to run a shorter one, then Unstable is going to be better suited for you. Now I will take Unstable Wall and demonstrate what I mean. I cast here, and you don't see them, but each one of these is a node, and they will explode in line after the 6 seconds. So you notice there that it starts from the first, and I will cast it on this mob so you can see as well. Since he is standing in between the first 2 nodes, he will take 2 damage sources. You notice there, Unstable Wall of Fire did 2 damage sources. So if an enemy is large enough, remember, they'll be able, their hitbox will encompass all 3 of these, allowing Unstable Wall's final damage source to be multiplied by 3 instead of 2, allowing for much more DPS than Blockade. So in terms of meta performance, Unstable is there if you're looking for a very fast, very difficult, but rewarding rotation. If you're looking for something a little bit easier, or if your kit already has too many short damage over time functions, such as the Templar or Sorcerer, then you'll want to take Blockade, as its extra duration will ease your rotation, making it so you don't lose as much DPS if you let it fall off for a second or 2. So again, Unstable Wall if you're looking for the really, really hardcore min-max DPS, very hard rotation, and your kit allows for room for it. And then Blockade if you are newer to it, learning, or your kit doesn't allow you to run more short dots, such as the Templar or Sorcerer. So in meta performance in PvE, Unstable or Blockade should always be on your bar, single target or AoE. It will be one of your highest damage sources, if not the most. It will also synergize with the Maelstrom staff, allowing your light attacks to enemies inside of your Wall of Elements to deal additional damage. Very, very strong meta for every build. In PvP, however, remember, it is a ground AoE, so it's going to be very easy to move out of. So I usually only use Unstable Wall, and that's only when I'm fighting in towers or around choke points. So I wouldn't cast this in open world because it's going to be very easy to walk out of. However, this does change if you do have immobilizes in your kit or if you use a Frost Staff. So very, very strong in those regards as well. Our next ability is our damage over time single target component of the Destruction Staff, which is Destructive Touch. It is a single target ability, can only be casted from a 17 meters range, costs quite a hefty bit of Magicka, almost twice as much as Force Shock, and will last 8 seconds. It will be broken into two things, an initial hit and a damage over time, meaning the initial hit will only scale off of Elemental Expert, while the damage over time will scale off of Elemental Expert and Thaumaturge. It will scale with all of the same stuff, max Magicka, spell damage, spell critical, and spell penetration. Again, just as our other skills, this damage source will change based on the active staff you have out. So fire with flame staves, lightning with lightning staves, and frost with frost staves. This will also change what the secondary effect of this damage over time does. If you are using a flame staff, it will knock back the enemy. If you are using a frost staff, it will immobilize the enemy. And if you are using a shock staff, it will stun the enemy. Things to notice here is that knocking back with flame or stunning with a shock will proc the CC immunity on a target after it ends, while immobilizes will not, allowing for frost staves and frost destructive touch to really help keep enemies in place. So if you're going for a more support role in Cyrodiil, and you want to just keep people locked down as much as you can so they can't run out of that negate, can't run out of that banner, then the Frost Staff route is going to be better for you. And it's also going to make you tankier thanks to our passives, which I'll get to later. In terms of meta performance right now, Destructive Touch in PvE is not really doing well because of its extremely high cost and its rather low damage. Now we'll look at our morphs, and our first morph is called Destructive Clench, which adds additional elemental effects. Flame Clench, again, if using a Flame Staff, will deal more damage over time and retain its knockback. The frost portion will immobilize an enemy longer, and Shock Cleanse will deal additional damage to nearby enemies. So adds a cleave, which will split up to 2, similar to the heavy attack version of the lightning attack. But in terms of meta performance, Destructive Clench, if you decide to run it, or if you are using a Master Staff, you will want to use Flame Destructive Clench, as its damage will be increased by Master Staff, making it a semi-reasonable damage over time ability to run. However, in terms of most PvE builds, there isn't room for it because it's not justified. It's not going to deal enough damage to most enemies by its high cost, low duration, and its shorter range. Our other morph is called Destructive Reach, which increases the range from 17 meters to 28 and retains all of the good stuff that the base morph does. So in PvP, this gives you a little bit extra range. However, I really don't see the purpose of Destructive Reach at the moment. I believe Destructive Clench is far stronger in every application. So I'd kind of like to see Destructive Reach add a little bit more to it. Maybe have some sort of lingering effect where it places a node on the ground after the damage over time effect ends, or after the initial hit ends, where it deals additional damage or some sort similar to Wall of Elements. I think that'd be really cool and add some diversity in between morph options. But again, for meta performance, the only time we're really going to take this is in PvP if we're trying to have an on-demand stun / knockback, or in PvE if we're running a Master Staff. However, that isn't really in the meta at the moment because it's a very weak ability. It's not going to do as much damage as our other damage over time, so really not going to be as justified. I'd like to see the cost go a little bit down and the damage go up. Pretty much remove the Master Staff and make that a part of the base skill, because without the Master Staff, this skill is not worth running at all in endgame performance. Our next ability is the debuff or utility portion of the Destruction Staff line, which is Weakness to Elements. In and of itself, the base morph can be casted from a 28 meters range, will last 21 seconds, but does not scale with anything as it does not deal damage or heal. All it does is it applies Major Breach to the target, so single cast, for 21 seconds, reducing their spell resistance by 50 to 80, meaning in PvE it will increase your damage with Magic, Flame, Lightning, and Frost by 10.56%, or with the same elements in PvP by 8%. In and of itself, I really don't like Weakness to Elements in its base morph. It's not doing a lot right now. Many other skills apply Major Breach much more effectively. On live servers, one of the morphs is definitely worth running. However, it's going to be reworked. And now we'll look at our morphs to explain that. So our first morph is called Elemental Susceptibility, which anytime you deal damage to a target with this skill on them, the debuff will refresh to its maximum duration, meaning you only need to cast this once. So you cast it once, and as long as you are dealing damage to that enemy, the skill will refresh to 21 seconds, meaning it'll be up forever pretty much, allowing for 100% application of Major Breach. However, I really don't think this is justified at the moment, as tanks are always going to be taunting every 12 to 15 seconds, and they apply Major Breach, so Major Breach is going to be up pretty much 100% anyway. So Elemental Susceptibility isn't going to be offering anything unique. We already have that in forms of a tank. And in terms of solar performance, we're not going to have to really worry about this because it doesn't cost anything to cast, so there's no cost. The only loss we get for casting this is the loss of a global cooldown proc, which is every 1 second you are committed to doing one complete animation or priority system. So one ability, one light attack, and one bash, dodge roll, or block. So that you can only do one of those per system. So that's the only thing it's doing, is preventing us from using another ability. And it's not going to really bring anything to us, so Elemental Susceptibility isn't going to be justified in and of itself. The other morph, Elemental Drain, however, will apply minor Magicka Steal to the enemy on top of inflicting Major Breach. So what minor Magicka Steal does is every time you or an ally, or both, deals damage to that target, it no longer has to be only elemental damage. You will proc minor Magicka Steal, which will restore 400 Magicka to you or your ally. Now this has a 1 second internal cooldown, or ICD, meaning you can only gain benefit of it at a maximum of once per second, meaning its maximum Magicka return value is 400. If you apply this to numerous enemies, you will still only be able to benefit from it once per second. This is ultimately the killer of Elemental Drain in its current form on the PTS. On live servers, the way it works is you apply this to a target, and anytime you deal elemental, meaning fire, lightning, or frost damage, you'll gain about 630 Magicka back for each and every damage source used against it. So, for instance, on live servers, if I place down Wall of Elements, do a light attack, and do a spammable such as Whip, I will be getting 3 Magicka Steal procs per second, because Wall of Elements will be ticking once per second. I can light attack once per second, and I can use an ability once per second, and that fits into our priority system, or our global cooldown system. So that's 3 Elemental Drain procs per second, making it very, very strong. And this can go up based on how many more dots we have. So if we're running things like Cinderstorm, or Engulfing Flames, or Burning Embers, or anything else that's going to deal elemental damage, we can get Elemental's Drain Magicka return to be even higher. So going from being able to proc multiple times per second, returning more Magicka, to only being able to proc it once per second at a less Magicka return, the elemental, or the Magicka Stain from live patch update 12 1 Tamriel to going to update 13 is going to be hit extremely hard. Now it won't be impossible to sustain anymore, but on top of this, other abilities will be able to apply minor Magicka Steal much more efficiently. So next patch, Elemental Drain will ultimately be a dead morph unless you are not a Templar healer or Templar class. So if you don't have access to things like Radiant Aura, then you're going to need to run Elemental Drain. And it's going to be helpful to you if you don't have any other Magicka sources, but in terms of organized PvE or PvP, in its current state, Radiant Aura is going to apply minor Magicka Steal to all targets within 28 meters, while Elemental Drain will only apply it to 1. So next patch in update 13, Elemental Drain and even weakness to elements will not be taken at all unless you are not a Templar healer. So Sorc healers don't have access to it, so they're going to need to run it. But even then, it's getting nerfed quite heftily compared to live. So I'd really like to see either the base cost go up or be able to benefit from it once per target instead of once at all. Still, on live servers, this is a very, very strong morph, always worth running. However, once update 13 goes live, again, it will not be ran anymore. Unless you are not playing an efficient class, like a Sorc healer or a DK healer, then you're still going to want to apply Minor Magicka Steel for your group, so you'll have to run Elemental Drain. Now we will go on to our AoE ability of the Destruction Staff line, which is Impulse. How it operates is you cast it from your person. It is a 6 meters radius, costs quite a bit of magicka, a little bit more than our Force Shock, but not as much as our Destructive Touch, and it deals damage based on the elemental staff type you are using, so fire for fire, lightning for lightning, and frost for frost. Very straightforward, does nothing fancy, and its current damage is kind of low. It will beat most classed spammables in terms of raw damage, but in terms of utility, it will be weaker, as well as the fact that it has a 6 meters AoE radius rather than many class AoEs, which are 8 or 9. Now we will look at our morphs, and our first morph is Elemental Ring. So instead of casting it around you, you can now cast this skill up to 28 meters away from you. The best way to describe this skill now is such Blazing Spear. So Blazing Spear or Liquid Lightning will pull up a reticle when you cast it, and then you cast it again to throw it at the designated area. Elemental Ring will do the same thing now. So this kind of reworks the skill, and it's going to be a little bit slower to use than its current state, because its current state is just you cast it and it instantly goes off. While now with Elemental Ring, you'll have to cast it twice, because once will pull up a reticle, and then you'll have to cast it again to make sure that it lands there, or you can turn on quick time casts to ensure that it happens immediately. I really like this change for PvP because it allows you to be much safer, allowing to hit more enemies from a range, really adding into a cool playstyle that I'll be using for a sorcerer build next patch, which I'm really looking forward to. So I don't mind the Elemental Ring change. I think it's going to be really interesting. But in terms of going, like if you're using Elemental Ring on live going into update 13, you're probably not going to use it anymore for the same application you are. So keep that in mind. Our other morph is called Pulsar, which keeps the same base morph operation with casting in a 6 meters radius around yourself per cast, but it will also now apply Minor Mangle to the enemy, reducing their maximum health by 10% for 30 seconds. And this will refresh each time you cast it, and if the buff falls off, they will gain their maximum HP back, but they won't gain the HP they lost. So let's say I have 1,000 health, and I have Minor Mangle casted on me. I will take, let's say Pulsar does 0 damage, just for the sake of this example. I will now jump to 900 health. Now, if 30 seconds were to fall off, my maximum health would go back to 1,000, but my current health would be stuck at 900 until I heal. So reapplying this isn't going to incur a loss where enemies' HP bars are just jumping up and down, allowing it to be very strong. And in terms of meta performance for both PvE and PvP, you always want at least one person in your group, if doing group play, to run Pulsar, because it's going to make sure that DPS has to kill or has to deal 10% less damage to each enemy, because they're only going to have 90% of their max HP instead of 100%. So in terms of effective DPS, this is very, very strong, as it's going to knock 10% off the board, except for bosses in PvE, in terms of damage that you have to do to kill a target. So it's going to be very, very efficient. In PvP, the same is said. Less max health means less damage you have to deal to kill an enemy, making it much easier to do so. So Pulsar is very, very strong, but you only need one person to run it, because Minor Mangle will not stack. And the only time it cannot be applied to an enemy is if they are exclusively resistant to it, which is very few times, mainly just bosses. However, some elite mobs may also be immune to it. However, in terms of like trials and stuff, almost every single trash enemy, like non-boss, non-essential entities you fight, will be afflicted by Pulsar or Minor Mangle, making it extremely, extremely efficient. I'll demonstrate here what Elemental Ring does now. So I cast it once and it pulls up my reticle, and then I can cast it up to 28 meters away and it instantly goes off. So I really like this change. Again, it's going to open up some diversity for some builds, allowing for some really cool gameplay that we aren't seeing much of in Cyrodiil right now. So I think that's going to be really awesome. Now we will go on to our ultimate, and that is Elemental Storm. This ultimate causes a lot of controversy because of how stupidly powerful it is. It costs a whopping 250 ultimate, meaning it does have the highest base cost in the game, akin to Banner. Its high cost is justified because of how powerful it is. It will deal damage each second for a maximum of 7 seconds. So again, it does retain that based on what type of staff you're using, it will change. And it has a 28 meters range, meaning you can cast it up to 28 meters away from you, and it has a 10 meters AoE radius, making it cover a big portion of the area. If we see here, I can hit both of these packs, allowing to hit all 5 once per second because of the raw size of this skill, and I can cast it from quite far away as well. So again, this will augment based on what staff you're using. In the base morph, it just changes the damage type. It won't add in anything special. But if we look at our morphs, the first morph we have is Elemental Rage, which will gain a new type or effect based on what staff you're using. So if you're using a flame staff, the skill itself will deal 10% more damage. Really straightforward, really, really strong. If you're using an ice staff, it will immobilize an enemy for 3 seconds every time it deals damage, meaning it will immobilize an enemy for 10 seconds at its maximum duration. So if they can't dodge roll, they can't purge themselves, that every damage tick is reapplying, so the 7 seconds plus 3 after it ends, that's a 10-second immobilize. Very, very strong for keeping enemies in place. And then if we're using a lightning staff, it will increase the duration from 7 seconds to 9 seconds, allowing for 2 additional damage ticks. So we're always going to want, in PvE, we're always going to want to either take Fiery Rage or Thunderous Rage, which is the lightning. Usually we'll take Fiery Rage just because that 10% damage is going to be absolutely massive. So very, very strong. So in PvP, we can take Icy Rage, the Frost Staff one, which will allow us to keep enemies in place. So if we're trying to play the more support role, locking enemies in place, making sure they can't leave those devastating AoEs, then Icy Rage is going to be really, really strong. However, in PvP, most of the time, we're going to want to take our other morph, and that is Eye of the Storm. And Eye of the Storm is an extremely devastating ultimate. So you'll notice here that it no longer scales, or it no longer has a range, because instead of casting it at a designated area, it will now be casted around you and will follow you for the duration, allowing you to move freely. The really nice thing about this in PvP is if an enemy tries to run away with you, you can simply follow them, making it so they can't escape from Eye of the Storm. The other thing is, if you are negated, since this is not a damage, or since this is not a magical effect, it will not be removed. Elemental Rage will be placed at an area, and if an enemy negate goes on top of it, it will be consumed. So Eye of the Storm has very little counterplay in PvP. On top of this, there's also an issue right now where Eye of the Storm is ignoring block mitigation. So normally when you block, if you don't have any amps, you reduce damage taken by 50% and consume stamina every 0.5 seconds. So the thing with Eye of the Storm is that's going to ignore. So if you're blocking, it's going to consume your stamina, but it's not going to deal 50% less damage. So this is a big reason why in PvP we can see Eye of the Storm doing monstrous damage, doing over 15,000 damage per tick in some application. Many builds that use Clever Alchemist and other amplifications such as Magicka can get bursts of spell damage in max Magicka, allowing Eye of the Storm to do monstrous damage in a very short duration. So in and of itself, both Elemental Rage and Eye of the Storm can do some stupid high damage because it deals almost as much damage as a Shooting Star if you look at Shooting Star's initial and damage over time, but in less time because it's a 7-second duration instead of a 12-second. And it's going to cover more range, it's going to be casted further away, and it's going to be really, really strong. So for PvE, we're going to want to take Elemental Rage for a situation where enemies aren't clumped up. So a Meteor is going to cost less, and it's going to do AoE and do about the same damage over more time, but it's not going to be as big. And in most of the times, enemies aren't going to clump up as nicely. So Elemental Rage allows us to cover a much larger area, doing more damage. So in meta performance, Fiery Rage is the morph that we're probably going to take. Unless we're a Sork, we might take Thunderous Rage, and it's going to do crazy DPS. And in PvP, it doesn't matter which one we take. We're going to do a lot of damage to players because they can't block it. So I'd really like to see Eye of the Storm blockable. On PTS, these have both been nerfed by 5% from live. I don't think this is enough. I think the big issue was you can't block Eye of the Storm. And if they did that, I think it would be in a better place. In terms of holistic balance, I might increase the duration to 9 seconds just so it deals less burst damage, but still deals the same amount overall. Just because it's doing a lot of damage in a short amount of time, but still an extremely fantastic and devastating ultimate in both PvE and PvP application. Now we will look at our passives, and our first passive ability is called Try Focus, which allows us to gain benefit based on what staff type we're using. So Try Focus is an augment to heavy attack, so it'll only be affected, or it'll only apply when heavy attacking. The only exception to this is Frost Staves, but what happens is if you're using a Flame Staff, your fully charged heavy attacks will deal 12% additional damage. Pretty straightforward, not really mandatory if we're going the Flame Staff route, just because heavy attacking takes too long, doesn't deal enough damage, isn't very dynamic, but in terms of beginner performance, many heavy attack builds are easier for players to use, especially on the Dragon Knight with Molten Armaments and other amplifications, allowing it to be fun and easy, but not necessarily effective. So pretty straightforward. Our next one is when using a Shock Staff, we will do additional damage to nearby enemies based on 100% of the damage done. So if we look here, if I do use a heavy attack with a Lightning Staff, it channels, and then the final one explodes. So the nice thing here is if you look, Try Focus is proccing 3 times every tick, allowing for some really, really strong AoE damage. So I'm hitting all 4 targets here because of Try Focus. And this is the strength of the Lightning Staff in PvE, is cleave damage. The same in PvP, is we're able to heavy attack, and we're able to get benefit from Try Focus every tick of damage, allowing for very easy damage. We're going to be able to apply things like Concussive to more targets, meaning minor vulnerability on more targets. So Lightning Staff heavy attacking is going to be really, really strong, as opposed to just a Flame Staff, where we're going to hit one target, and sure, it'll do more damage, but it's not going to be nearly as effective as a Lightning Staff. So Frost Staffs rework in Update 13 into tank weapons, and what they do is a fully charged heavy attack with a Frost Staff will taunt the target you deal damage to for 15 seconds, akin to Puncture or Inner Beast, as well as granting the user a damage shield, absorbing 10,000 damage. And this damage shield has no scaling coefficients. The only way to get this up more is to use the Bastion in the champion point system, increasing the effectiveness of shields. So, the damage shield is really, really small. It's going to be even smaller in Cyrodiil, and heavy attacking in Cyrodiil, you can't taunt a player with a a skill, you can taunt them with shit talk, but that's different. So we're not going to have much use of this passive in Cyrodiil, but in PvE, we're going to be able to taunt enemies with heavy attacks. But the issue with that is heavy attacking drops block, and as a tank, you are most susceptible when not blocking. So the idea is to block up all the time and cast skills while blocking. You notice here, I can still cast while blocking without losing it. So if I heavy attack, though, I'm not going to be able to do that, which is going to make me susceptible, so not very strong. I'm not sure why they decided to go this path. It's interesting and cool, but it's not going to be effective in any way, shape, or form for PvE or PvP for that portion of it. However, the nice thing about this is when using a Frost Staff while blocking, instead of consuming stamina and turning off our stamina resource management, we will now use Max Magicka to block, as well as turning off our Magicka management. So we're going to be able to gain stamina, and we're not going to have our stam consumed when using a Frost Staff and blocking. We're going to use Magicka. So the really nice thing about this is you can use a Sword and Shield on one bar and a Frost Staff on your other, and use both of your resource pools to block. So I think perma-blocking is going to come back in PvP. It already is in PvE just because really good utility like Shards and Repentance are able to be used. DKs are able to make good use of passives like Earthen Heart and whatnot. So in PvE, Frost Staff tanking is not going to be a thing. But in PvP, blocking makes you tankier, makes you harder to kill, makes it so enemies waste their burst, allowing you for moments of opportunity. So Frost Staff tanking is going to be really, really strong because it's going to effectively double the duration in which you can block and allow your other resource pool to bolster back up while you drain one. So if I block on my Sword and Shield and drain all my stam, I can then swap to my Frost Staff and drain my Magicka and let my stamina return, allowing me to swap in between them freely, as well as making both the utilization of Magicka and stamina management from things like Minor Magicka Steel or Shards, making it so I can block even longer, so I can live even longer, being even harder to kill and giving me more opportunity to kill enemies. So in terms of balance, I think this is going to really throw things up in the air with Cyrodiil, and it's going to be very meta in PvP. Frost Staff tanking is going to be really strong, especially since it fits that really nice support role of keeping enemies in place, snaring, immobilizing. It's going to be really, really strong, so I'm kind of worried, but we'll see what happens. It's cool, it's interesting, but in PvE, nah. You're not going to see it, and if you do, it's not going to be efficient. But now we'll go on to our next passive, which is Penetrating Magic. Luckily, this is a simple one. All it does is your Destruction Staff abilities now ignore 10% of the enemy's spell resistance. And the nice thing about Penetrating Magic is it's going to apply before your penetration. So things like debuffs like Major Breach and Minor Breach and things that reduce their resistance is going to reduce the efficiency, but your penetration will apply after Penetrating Magic, meaning Penetrating Magic won't be useless. It won't be the full 10% of their resistances, but it'll still be usable in some way, shape, or form. So it's not a very strong passive in PvE because we're going to want to be applying these debuffs that's reducing their resistances so we can do more damage. But in PvP, we don't have the opportunity to min-max to apply all this stuff to make sure it's up 100%, so Penetrating Magic is going to be much stronger against enemies using shields or heavy armor or who just have really high resistances, so we're going to gain much more effectiveness out of that, increasing our damage to tankier players. So a very nice, simple passive. Our next passive is called Elemental Force, which simply increases the chance to apply those status effects when using a Destruction Staff. So Burning, Concussed, and Chilled will have an additional 100% chance to activate when dealing damage of the respective type. So remember, Burning procs from flame damage, Concussion procs from shock, and Chilled procs from frost damage. And then what they do is, earlier what I said in the video, Burning will apply a flame debuff or a flame dot 6 seconds, does really nice damage. Concussion will apply minor vulnerability, increasing the damage an enemy takes by 8%, and shield will apply minor maim, ensnaring the enemy, reducing damage they deal by 15%. Very straightforward, makes it easier to use, and the rate in which these apply are each damage ability, or each weapon enchant has a 20% chance to proc their respective. So if you're using a flame weapon enchant, that'll be a 20% chance to proc burning every time it procs. Abilities, like single target class abilities, will have a 10% chance to apply their respective secondary effects. So if you're using whip on a DK, that'll be a 10% chance every whip to apply burning. AoE abilities that are instant casts, such as impulse and whatnot, will have a 5% chance to apply their secondary effects. Damage over time effects will have a 3% chance per damage source. So if you apply things like destructive touch that hits one target, that'll be a 3% every damage tick over the duration to proc their respective status effect. And then AoE damage over time effects, such as Wall of Elements, will have a 1% chance to apply their status effect per tick. So keep that in mind, that this will apply, the 100% will just double the effectiveness. So 40% from weapon enchants, 20% from abilities, 10% from AoEs, 6% from damage over time, and 2% from AoE damage over time. So this increases the chance, making it easier to keep up burning, concussed, and shield, increasing our DPS if we're using burning, increasing our utility if we're using lightning, and increasing our tanking utility if we're using chilled, because chilled is going to be that minor maim, keeping enemies in place. Concussion is going to be that 8% more damage from minor vulnerability, and burning is just going to be that extra damage. So really simple passive, but very, very effective in what it does. In terms of holistic DPS, burning, the double chance to proc burning isn't going to be astronomical. It'll probably be about a 600 DPS boost if not using this to using it. But things like concussion allow you to keep up minor vulnerability longer and easier, near 100% uptime if we're using things like Wall of Elements, Force Shock, Destructive Touch, and other lightning abilities. We're going to be able to keep up minor vulnerability almost indefinitely, so very, very strong. Our next passive is called Ancient Knowledge, and how this passive works is while you have a Destruction Staff ability slotted, you gain additional bonus effects based on the staff type you're using. So if you are using a Flame Staff actively, you will increase your damage done with single target abilities by 8%. If you're using a Lightning Staff, you will gain 8% damage with your AoE damaged effects. And then if you are using a Frost Staff, you will reduce the cost of blocking by 30% and increase the amount of damage you can block by 20%, similar to the Sword and Board passive. So very straightforward, and a lot of people think this is going to change up the meta of PvE and PvP in terms of damage and like what staff to use, where to use it, and whatnot. But in reality, the biggest issue with this pass in its current state is it only looks at the staff you have out actively. So, for example, if I have a Lightning Staff on my back bar, I'm going to get 8% damage when I cast this skill. However, if I swap to a Flame Staff, I will lose that 8% damage. So if we look here, I'll cast it, and then I'll swap, and see I immediately lost damage. But if I swap back, we'll see 758, 758, swap to 702, swap back 758. So it actively looks at what staff you have out, meaning if you cast damage over time effects from your back bar and then swap to your main bar where you have single target abilities, you're not going to be gaining 8% damage, meaning this effectiveness is only active when your bar is open. So it's really not going to be good on boss fights, because not everything we do is going to be single target or AoE. Many of our abilities, even if we use them in single target, might have AoE components. Things like Engulfing Flames, Wall of Elements, etc. That all deals AoE damage, and even if we're only hitting one target, we're not going to get the 8%. so really reduces our efficiency. But on the other hand, if I do use a lightning staff, I'm going to lose 8% weaving damage. I'm going to lose 8% with things like force pulse or my main spammable, unless it's an AoE. And I'm going to lose things like single target ultimates and whatnot. So I really don't think that this passive is going to change much in terms of meta performance. I think most builds, most, not all, will use the same thing they've been using. So the Templar will probably still be using dual wield and a flame staff, because on top of, like, a Templar might use AoE abilities like Jabs would use a lightning staff, Reflective Light would use a lightning staff, however its Dot would use a flame staff. Our ultimates, we would use a lightning staff. But the issue is if we use dual wield in a lightning staff, we lose Wall of Fire's additional 20% damage to fire targets. We're going to lose out efficiency on running sets like Burning Spell Weave, which are really, really strong. So in terms of meta performance for PvE, I really don't think Ancient Knowledge is going to change anything. In PvP, it definitely will, because most builds are revolved around either AoE or single target damage, single target for small man, or open world like dueling, and then AoE for big small man fighting big man, or Zerg to Zerg, stuff like that. So you're going to be able to make your more use out of this passive in PvP than in PvE. So I don't really think this is going to shake anything up. In terms of meta performance, it's going to add a little bit of diversity, but remember, you only gain this bonus with the staff you currently have out. I think that's ultimately going to be the killer. I think if they made it so it casted based on what staff you casted it from, so if I casted Wall of Lightning on a lightning staff, if I bar swapped, if that retained the 8%, then that would be big. That would change up builds, because then we could be minimizing and maximizing things like, okay, well, sure, I might not be able to run Wall of Elements, but I'll still gain an 8%. Or, oh, I can just swap to my back bar and cast my AoE dots, gain the 8%, and then swap to my Flame Staff. It would allow for diversity. It would make the player make informed choices and test and experience things and see what works best. Versus now, because it operates the way it does, we're just going to do what we've always done. And a few builds will change, but not many. So I don't think it's going to be that big of a deal. Still, it's a very strong passive when they are able to be applied to their skills in full efficiency. But it's never going to get that full 8% value unless everything you're doing is single target. But that's almost impossible, because even if we were using all single target skills and meta performance, we wouldn't be running proper meta skills like Wall of Fire and whatnot. So really not that game-changing, but still a good passive. Our last passive is called Destruction Expert, and luckily this is a very simple one. Whenever you have a Destruction Staff out and you kill an enemy with a Destruction Staff ability, you will gain 3,600 Magicka. As simple as that. Now, the only issue with this is if you swap to a non-destruction staff ability and you still kill an enemy. Like, let's say I had dual wield swords on my back bar and I casted Wall of Elements and I killed a target with my dual wield out, I would not gain benefit of Destruction Expert, meaning you have to have your destruction staff out. But if you do, you're gaining a lot of Magicka back every time you're killing an enemy. That means light attacks, weapon abilities, ultimates. Anytime you deal damage with the Destruction Staff and you kill an enemy, it will proc Destruction Expert, giving you some massive amount of Magicka back, really helping out sustain in the solo application of PvE and in PvP. So things like Maelstrom Arena or 4-man dungeons, this is going to be a really, really strong passive if we can make use of it. Placing down our Wall of Elements, making sure things die in it, heavy attacking low health targets if they're far away, or using Force Pulse or AoEs like this. If we drop an Elemental Rage, if enemies die to Elemental Rage, we'll be getting lots and lots of Magicka back. So that's going to be a really strong passive and really help out classes such as the Templar or Dragon Knight get more Magicka back when they're killing targets with it, especially in places like Maelstrom Arena where you have to get all of your resources back on your own and you don't have a healer throwing orbs or applying Magicka Steel. So this is going to be a really strong passive for PvE and in PvP if you know how to use it. In trials and stuff, it's not going to be as strong because there are going to be more players killing stuff, and it's not anytime a target dies, it's anytime you kill a target. So solo application, very strong passive. Group application, not as good. But still very strong passive and very strong skills in the skill line. Almost every one of these abilities can be used. Elemental Storm, both of its morph, amazing ultimates in both PvE and in PvP. Force Shock and its morphs have use. Crushing Shock for PvP, and then Force Pulse for PvE as a great spammable. Wall of Elements, undeniably the best AoE damage over time effect or ability in the game for DPS. And in PvP, not going to be as strong, but we can still use it, especially unstable in niche application. If we're using a Frost Staff, that's going to help keep enemies in place. We can cast it at a choke point, allowing for enemies to force to run through it, dealing some nice damage. Destructive Touch, arguably one of our weaker skills, still can be used if we use a Master Staff, or in PvP if we're trying to CC enemies, create some distance, etc. That's going to be a decent skill there. Weakness to Elements was one of the best Magicka tools in the game. Now it's not going to be nearly as good because Radiant Aura is going to come in and its effectiveness is going to decrease. I'd like to see something happen to Weakness to Elements. And then Impulse and its morphs. Pulsar are going to be very strong to have one person in a group run. Elemental Ring going to be cool for some new builds. Not going to be as meta. It's going to be more fun, but still a good ability. Pulsar definitely worth running. And then we have some great passives now, and I'm really glad ZeniMax reworked these passives because prior to update 13, some of these passives were really, really bad, and I'm glad they've been reworked. There's still some work to do, especially with Ancient Knowledge. I'd like to see some of them reworked so you can gain use of them all the time instead of in niche application, and gain more effectiveness out of them, but still very strong abilities and passives. So that is it for the Destruction Staff skill line. Thank you all so much for watching. If I have misspoken, please leave a comment below. I will add an annotation for whatever needs to be added. If you know of a cool way to use these abilities, drop a comment too. Hopefully you guys have learned something from this. Hopefully this helps. Next will be the final skill line, which is Restoration, and then we're going to do the armor passives, and then we'll start getting into the other stuff as well. But again, thank you so much for watching. Again, hope this has been helpful, but I will see you guys next time.